So am I up? Okie dokie. Well, thank you for inviting me a second time. And tonight we're talking about an event that, a topic that is ongoing. I mean, the title of the talk that went out was History of Ukraine, but that somehow in the email, I think that as things were communicated, the precise talk is a historical contextualization of the Russo-Ukrainian War. And so to attempt to do a history of Ukraine in the next 40 minutes, even to attempt what I'm going to do is a lot to be done. So it certainly isn't going to be the entire history of Ukraine. However, before I put the slides up, and I will go through the slides, and then after the presentation, I'll take the slides down, obviously, and we can have a conversation. I should mention that when I received an email from Jim early March, I think it was just a little personal comment. I think it was March 1st, actually, very early March. Jim had sent an email asking if I would be interested to do another talk. And he had said, well, maybe this one on the history of Russia since Peter the Great, given the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And my first reaction was, no, I'm not going to touch that one. I don't want to go near it at this point. And in particular, as I've been away from Russian, initially Soviet, and then Russian studies for a while. I have a master's in Russian studies, but then my PhD was in world history, and I have been away from Soviet studies in the 80s, obviously, and then Russian studies in the 90s as I attempted to offer courses on Russian history. And back in the early 90s, the students weren't as interested in Russian history. In the 80s, the Soviet history class always filled up. But once the Soviet Union was gone, the Russian history course just never filled. And of course, Soviet studies programs found similar problems across the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I did get away from Soviet/Russian studies. And so when I received that email, I was thinking, well, should I clear the cobwebs out and do a little work? And then I thought, yes, of course I should. This is a topic that we should be having discussions about. This is something that we should, by all means, try to share what we know and to learn more as we move forward. So all I can offer you tonight is a historical perspective on what I know and what I've been brushing up on the past few months. And rekindling the work that I had done in the 80s and 90s, really early 2000s, when I actually had an exchange program with Moscow Pedagogical University, which used to be called the Institute for the Pedagogical Sciences, named after V.I. Lenin. And when I visited the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation in the 90s, setting up and doing this exchange, it was an exciting time, I have to say, and it was a hopeful time in the early 90s, as we thought the Cold War was over, a fresh beginning was before us, and yet here we are in 2022, where all that has been dashed, and where there seems to be no hope at all, as war, for the first time in a major war, has unfolded on the continent or in Europe, with massive devastation to cities and thousands upon thousands of lives lost. And I think the scale is very different from what happened in the Kosovo War. And that's why I'm saying this is the first time we've seen a major ground invasion of one European country against another since World War II. And the repercussions will continue. And we'll try and tease out what some of them might be at the end of the presentation. So thank you, Jim, for inviting me. And I just wanted to let you know this was some of the background that led, if you would, to this talk. So let me share the slides so we can start the proper presentation. So the title is Historical Context for the Russo-Ukrainian War, 2014 to the Present. And I do mean 2014. For many people, the war just began in February. However, this war between with Russia as the aggressor has been going on since 2014. And if we recall, in 2014, Putin's Russia did um, invade, occupy, and annex the Crimea. And shortly thereafter, created the conditions and organized, funded, and spirited along the Russian separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, in the Donetsk and Luhansk region, now, of course, called the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, that has recently been recognized, of course, by the Russian Federation. So war has been going on, and it had already cost about 15,000 lives prior to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine in February. Added to that toll are thousands more. And as I'd mentioned, the devastation and destruction of many Ukrainian cities. So this has been going on a while. It's continuing, but it has roots. We have to ask ourselves, why now? Why has this war been going on since 2014 in one form, and now up a notch with the invasion of the Ukraine in February? What has brought us to this point? Like anything else, I think first we should always have good source materials. And so I just wanted to share with you some authors and books that I have found very instrumental and very useful in learning about some very important material and events in the history of Ukraine and Russia. And you can see them here. I don't know if you can do one of those screenshots or capture screens and you'll get them. But I'll just mention that Serhiy Plohy, who wrote The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine. That is a general history, and it's a very powerful one, and it's very readable. And he also has anything by Serhiy Plohy is really good. He also wrote The Lost Kingdom. That's a history of Russian nationalism. And Timothy Snyder is another fellow that if you want to read more about this, his work on the Bloodlands, on the history of Ukraine during the era of Hitler and Stalin is phenomenal. And Timothy Snyder also lectures widely on this topic as well. Anne Applebaum has written a variety of works, but her work on the Red Famine, Stalin's war in the Ukraine, the Holodomor, which we'll talk a little bit about as we move along, which is the state created famine by the Soviet state in 32-33 that resulted in millions of lost lives, Ukrainian lives, and also part of the really the decimation of the Ukrainian nationalist movement as well, in terms of leadership of the Ukrainian nationalists of that day. And Paul Dianeri's book, Ukraine and Russia, From Civilized, Divorced, Uncivil War, does a great historical context, but a great policy analysis of what's going on between the Ukraine and Russia. So I just thought these 5 books, if any, that you have a look at, these would be very good. All right, so let's begin with the history of Ukraine. And when we think about the history of Ukraine, frankly, it's something that we often don't think about. I mean, when I was in school as an undergraduate in the 70s, it was simply the history of Russia and the Soviet Union. Ukraine was just part of that. It was Little Russia, and it was not given the full attention that it really should as a separate history of, and not simply part of Russia's history. But you could say that Russia is an extension of Ukraine's history, which is a different take on things. And when we look at, now try and explain what that means in a little bit. But when you look at Ukraine today, you can see Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and the Baltic states, of course, the Eastern European states, and Russia and the Black Sea here. And I want you to just take a moment and just observe a little bit. What do you see here? Let's look at the location. Where is the Ukraine? The Ukraine, of course, is cutting right through it is the Dnieper River. the D is silent. Many say the Dnieper, but it's Dnieper River. And if you see the Ukraine, of course, straddle along the Dnieper as it enters into the Black Sea. It's also located in the westernmost part of the Eurasian steppe lands. Now, the steppes are something that go right across Eurasia into the northern territories of China. And the steppes, or the steppe lands, have historically, for thousands of years, been part of the migration routes of people out of the eastern and central Eurasian heartlands into the European, Eastern Europe, and then the European heartlands, as well as into the Balkans and the southern European areas. So it's sitting on major waterways connecting the Baltics, the Baltic Sea, and the Baltic countries, including the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. So it connects the northern areas of the Scandinavia down through the Black Sea, into the Aegean and Mediterranean. It also connects across Eurasia in terms of being an open steppe land, an open grasslands. And even though the northern areas of Ukraine are heavily forested, there is this huge steppe area that stretches right into Poland as well, that provides open access to peoples coming across Eurasia. So it has always been at the crossroads. And I want to just mention that because Ukraine has always been at the crossroads of migration, of culture, of conquest, of peoples coming in and conquering as well. So it is a crossroads territory. And I just want you to keep that in mind, just to have a geographical location. Now, when we think of Ukraine and Ukrainian history, we probably don't realize how far back we're going to go. But we are really going to go back to the 8th century. Now, I know I said I'd do this within a half hour, 40 minutes, but we're going back to the 8th century. So let me just mention a few things. We're going to go back to the 8th century and properly in the 9th century. So the 8th and 9th century, there's a lot going on. Just for context here, there's a tremendous amount going on in the world. The Vikings are on the move. And if you know your history a bit, that in the 8th and 9th centuries, the Vikings, the Norwegians and the Swedes, okay? When we think of the Vikings, we're thinking of really Sweden and Norway today, and Denmark. But the Norwegians and the Swedes were on the move. The Vikings were expanding. They were raiding into along the coast, of course, of England, the British Isles, what is today the United Kingdom. They were venturing as far, of course, south into what we think of as France today, hence Normandy. Normandy was settled by the Norsemen, and all the way around into the Mediterranean, in fact. And so the Norsemen, though, the Northmen, the Vikings, as they would become to be known in the area of the Volga and the Dnieper down into the Byzantine Empire, the Varangians. So the Vikings, or the Varangians, they would begin to come down into the area, what we see this little chunk of territory called Kievan Rus. Now, by the way, Kievan Rus, we use it to describe this area. It is a 19th century term, just to keep that in mind. Nobody in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, nobody until the 19th century ever called it Kievan Rus. Just like nobody in the period from the 4th century until the 15th century ever called the Eastern or the Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire. Just keep that in mind too. That's another 18th, 19th century, really 18th century construction. So there was no Byzantine. They never called themselves Byzantines. They always called themselves Romi, right? Romans, right to the very last Roman emperor, Constantine the 11th Paleologus, when he died fighting the Ottoman Turks on May 29th, 1453, he was not a Byzantine. He was a Roman. So just keep that in mind as well. We're using these terms, but they are created later. The peoples who came and settled this area of what we call Kievan Rus, they were Vikings. They settled the area, mixing over time with the Slavic peoples and a varieties of other peoples, I might add, who had settled there over the centuries. And this huge chunk of area would become, and here I have Kievan Rus, by the way, just a little note. So Kievan is the Ukrainian way of saying Kiev. And it's here, you can see the spelling Kyivan, Kievan Rus. And in time, the peoples living here, the Varangians who would settle, who would become the ruling class around Kiev, or Kiev is the Russian form, but Kiev, they would in time be known as the Rus. And we don't know what the first grand princes of Kievan Rus, how they referred to themselves. It was probably an Icelandic, some form of Scandinavian language, but eventually as they settle and mix, and as you know, languages change, they would become known as the Rus. And we think Rus, coming from an old Finnish word, ruitsi, which means those who row, the oarsmen who row. And of course, being that these were the Vikings and they were rowing their boats down the Dnieper and eventually at one point down the Volga and through the seas, that somehow we think it's stuck. And again, there's conjecture back and forth about the roots, but this one seems to make a lot of sense. And so I'm going with it. So in Kievan Rus, or Kievan Rus, as you can see, it becomes a huge chunk of area stretching from where modern day Ukraine right into much of what we think of as Russia today. And these are just three of the major cities, Kiev, Suzdal, and Novgorod. And when times settle sometime in the future, if you ever have a chance to go to Suzdal, Kiev, Suzdal, and Novgorod, I tell you, go. They're beautiful places. I only hope Kiev remains so during what I hope will be a reconstruction, but Suzdal and Novgorod, also beautiful. Suzdal, the last time I was there was now, it's 30 years ago, I can't believe it. But no trains, nothing. You have to catch a car to go there. Maybe they have trains now. Beautiful old city, though, both of them, and Novgorod as well. Just a little note. The point is, why did the Varangians come down, and why did they settle? Well, it was rich, of course, as they moved down the Dnieper. They began trading with even this says Byzantine, of course, Empire, with Constantinople. And that trade route, north-south, became very rich for many centuries. Now, I'm telling you this so you have a little background as to where we're going. This I just saw, and I thought it made a lot of sense. Kievan Rus, it says, where Russia was born in the north. Kiev, Kievan Rus down here. This is where the Ukrainians are. And this attempts to sort of, say, well, the Russians are up here as they emerge out of Muscovy later on, and they will. Kievan Rus, or Kievan Rus, is an area that starts in the 9th century, will emerge and become prosperous in a major state system into the 1200s. Muscovy, Moscow's not founded yet. I want you to keep that in mind. Modern Russia has its roots in the Duchy of Muscovy. Muscovy, around the city of Moscow, is not founded until the 13th and does not really begin prospering until the 14th, and it does not emerge as a major system until the 15th and 16th centuries, much later. So just something to keep in mind. Why spend this time? Well, who was the founder of Kievan Rus? According to the Russians, Vladimir the Great. His Ukrainian name is Volodymyr. The name he probably called himself again was some form of a Scandinavian name that we're not quite sure of. He is a descendant, of course, he is part of the Rurik dynasty, and he is clearly a descendant of the Varangians, the Vikings, and he will, along with his son Yaroslav, who would be known as Yaroslav the Wise, the two of them would reign for about 50 years. And they would really prosper. They would create a very powerful state of Kievan Rus. And Yaroslav the Wise would marry many of his daughters. Of course, he was known as the grandfather of the European monarchies and principalities, or he was essentially, or maybe the father-in-law would be the better way to put him, because many of his offspring would be married to kings and princes throughout Europe. So the progenitor, the early form of Ukraine, of this Rus period, would become a major, before Europe is even thought of as Europe, but a major European state system. And he would be the one, Vladimir here. This is a statue of him. There is one erected, of course. This one is in Kiev. It's overlooking the Dnieper River. And he would, of course, I say of course, he would lend assistance to the Byzantine Emperor Basil II. And then there would be a little kerfuffle where Basil had promised to him that he would marry his daughter. And then the Byzantine Emperor, I'll just use Byzantine, it's the one we all know. The Byzantine Emperor reneged, and then Volodymyr appeared at the gates of Constantinople and said, you said we could marry, if not, then this means war. Essentially, Basil then said, yes, it's a good idea. And so he married the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor. And it's, as a result, he became a Christian. And so Volodymyr is known here as the one who brought Christianity to Rus and to the lands beyond Rus in the north. It took several hundred years, of course, to complete, but he accepted Christianity for his realm as well as for himself, as in this dynastic marriage. Now, isn't that wonderful, you say? Okay, let's get to the war and the more modern stuff. However, what's important here is to realize is that Vladimir, as the Russians call him, and in the Russian Orthodox Church, it's Saint Vladimir, because in 988 is the date, and there's a whole story about how he thought about whether he should have Judaism, whether he should have Islam, and he finally settled with Christianity. And the reality is that that's part of the sort of the mythology about the creation of Christianity. The reality was much more practical. He married the Byzantine emperor's daughter in exchange for military support, which in turn gave him trade routes that helped enrich his kingdom. So it was really an old style dynastic economic motivation thing. Yet the other Vladimir, who's the president of Russia today, he has said, and I'm going to quote from Vladimir Putin. He said this in 2014. Our concerns are understandable. This is not Volodymyr from Rus. This is Vladimir Putin from Russia today. In 2014, he said, our concerns are understandable because we are not simply close neighbors, meaning with Ukraine, but as I have said many times already, we are one people. Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. Ancient Rus is our common source, and we cannot live without each other. Now, this is Putin in 2014, and he had made these references many times prior, as he said, and he says this, of course, once he annexes Crimea and once he instigates the separatist movements in the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, in the eastern part of Ukraine. And 2 years later, well, actually 1 year later in 2015, he begins the construction of a huge statue of Saint Vladimir, Volodymyr the Great, huge, over 50 feet tall. And he's taking now the founder and the hero of the Ukraine, and he is building a statue, and he places it outside of the Kremlin wall in a very prominent position. And it becomes a huge event in 2016 when it's consecrated. And I just want to show you a clip, if I may. And the first clip is only in Russian. So I'm going to open it up and just to give you a flavor for the event. And I think it'll have impact for what we'll talk about as we move along. And then a short clip, 35 seconds, of Vladimir Putin telling us what he thinks about Saint Volodymyr or Saint Vladimir. So here we go. Let's see if it works. Can you see this? Everyone can see it?
No,
Yet.
not
Not
yet.
yet? Okay, hold on.
Or should I say yet?
Oh, you said yet. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Okay, let's try again. Can you see this? No.
No.
Okay, this may not work after all. What about now?
I hear some music, but
All right.
Are you
I'm gonna
sharing?
try- I'll
you
try
sharing
one
your
more
screen?
time, and then if it doesn't work, then I'll stop. Oh, wait, you're right. I'm sharing the wrong thing. All right. Sorry for the delay. Here we go. So let's just get a flavor for this. You can see this, right?
yes.
Yes.
Господу помолимся.
Господи Боже Вседержителю, Бог Отец наших, благослови и освети памятник сей в честь святаго равноапостольного Венеси освященному Духу, ныне и присно и во веки веков, и освящается память освященная. Во имя Отца и Сына. Аминь.
So this is one more thing. Hold on. Oops. Okay. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, now you can read the subtitles. This is Putin. So this is this event. The fellow you saw doing the blessing of this huge statue right outside the Kremlin wall, very prominent position. Of course, a huge event. You have the president of Russia. This is 2016. The president of Russia, the prime minister, all the dignitaries, the fellow with that white hat. That's the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill. Kirill, who has, of course, supported the war, Putin's war, and of course he would because he's been enriched by Putin, and among other things, and the Russian Orthodox Church has had a renaissance under Putin. So you could say that it's really corrupt right now, but I won't say that. But there's the patriarch doing the blessing, and now listen to the words of Vladimir Putin.
почему единство нашей страны.
Отец Владимир навсегда вошел в историю как собиратель и защитник русских земель, как дальновидный политик, созидавший основы сильного, единого, централизованного государства. И сегодня наш долг вместе противостоять современным вызовам и угрозам, опираясь на духовные советы.
So that's it. And I know it took me longer to do than it should have, but it's the technology.
God's sake.
No,
this man can-
there we go. Let me get back to this. So I have to reshare. Too much to do here. All right. Okay. So where are we? Oh. So here we are. This is powerful. Putin is saying that this fellow Vladimir from Rus, is our spiritual legacy. He's making the direct connection spiritually, politically, in terms of a centralized state, in every way possible. And he's laying claim to the Ukrainian heritage. And he's saying it is Russian heritage, Russian Ukrainians, the same thing. He has said in other remarks that, and mind you, he is going back to a tradition that dates back into Imperial Russia of the 18th century, when Ukrainians were simply seen as Little Russians, where Ukraine was referred to geographically as Little Russia, where, and again, it had not had any independence since Kievan Rus. The only independence that a Ukrainian state of any kind would have would be in 1918, and that was short-lived. And the only other time is 1991. And so Vladimir Putin is building on a tradition going into the Imperial Russian tradition that the Ukrainians are simply Little Russians, Little Russia. They are us. There is no such thing as Ukraine, is what Putin is saying. There is no such thing as a Ukrainian state. It is a foreign imposition, and it represents a threat to our national security, is what he's really saying in the subtext. And the invasion in February 22 just sort of puts an exclamation mark on that notion. And because when the Russians invaded in February, they didn't just go in to secure the eastern provinces and the Crimea that the Russians under Putin have said are essentially majority Russian speakers. He attempted an entire invasion encircling Kyiv, attempting to take the capital with an attempt to decapitate the leadership and impose, as he thought he would, as he did in Crimea and in the Donbass, a puppet government, and get rid of once and for all Ukrainian independent government of any sort. That failed initially. We'll see what happens next. This is why this historical moment is important, because he is essentially attempting to erase history and impose a new history. Or as Orwell says, the victors write the history. He's attempting to be the victor who will write the history. Now, instead of people just falling by the wayside, of course, there's been this huge resistance, this huge response, and he's united NATO in a way that it could never be united in the past 30 years, with the exception of Erdogan in Turkey, which is another story. So we'll see how that plays out. So that's why I just wanted to really emphasize this point about the importance of Kievan Rus as it's playing out today. And just a little, I know we're at the half-hour mark and beyond, so let me just move a little quickly through this so we can get to questions. But I do have a few things I need to say, so I guess it's taking me a little longer. What happens after Kievan Rus? By the 1200s, the Mongols invade. The once prosperous land of the Ruriks, if you would, collapses, as do most everyone else. This here is, it shows you, of course, the reach of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire will consume all of what was Rus and what was the northern areas of Rus, right into, of course, Europe, as you can see. However, eventually, by the 13th and 14th centuries, after a period of almost 300 years, the Mongol era will end. And what will emerge is a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So keep this in mind, that what is Ukraine, Belarus, at some point, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and parts of what we think of as European Russia today will all become part of the combined kingdom of Poland and Lithuania. Now, there's a whole history around this, and we're not obviously going to get into it. It goes through different forms, but eventually it'll be an elected monarch with a parliament, if you would, not quite a parliament, but an assembly of nobles that will elect the king. And this will be a major force in this region. Mind you, we're not talking about, at this point, a major Russian empire. We go from Kievan Rus to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. During this time, Muscovy will emerge, and eventually, by the 17th and 18th century, you can see all of these different colors. We will see the Imperial Russian Empire of the Romanovs. Prior to that, well, I won't mention prior to that, except to say that prior to that, the Rurik dynasty will fade away, the last of the Varangian lineage, with the Ivans, Ivan the Great and Ivan the Terrible, who will again, like their forerunner Volodymyr, it will be Ivan III who really does help end the Mongol era. Ivan III, often known as Ivan the Great, not to be confused with Ivan Grozny the Terrible, but Ivan will marry the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. Again, to solidify a sort of a claim that Russia is taking the mantle where once Kievan Rus was a center for the Orthodox Christian Church, now so too Russia in Moscow would become the mantle, with the marriage of the niece of the last emperor of Byzantium, claiming the mantle as the Third Rome. And that mantle as the Third Rome, as the heartland of the Eastern Orthodox Church, would also be taken by the Romanov dynasty that starts in the 17th century and will be brought right into the 20th century until the last of the Romanovs are executed during the Russian Revolution. During that whole time, however, there continues to be the development of a Ukrainian identity that we can see emerging in terms of Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian national anthem, and a Ukrainian book of Genesis that talks about the origins of the Ukraine in the 19th century. In the 19th century, often referred to as the age of nationalism in Europe. And we know this, if you look at many of the Eastern European states and the Balkan states, and they would become Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, and they would become independent states as they throw off the control of the Byzantine Empire and eventually of the Austro-Hungarian Empire over time, and we'll see the development of national states, nation states. That will become a phenomenon globally in the 19th and 20th centuries. It will also be playing out for the Ukrainians, and with Ukrainian nationalism. It's not of any accident that in the mid to late 19th century, the Imperial Russian government will outlaw the use of Ukrainian language in the Ukraine. It will outlaw Ukraine, and it'll stop the teaching of Ukrainian. It will attempt to crush any hopes of Ukrainian cultural renaissance and nationalism. Now, in 1905, with the Russian Revolution, those prohibitions against Ukrainian culture and language are lifted, and when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, is born with the Russian Revolution of 1917 after the 2 years of civil war. And by 1918, 1920, the USSR will do a real pivot from what the Imperial Russians were doing. They will agree, yes, there are many nationalities, and our new union will be a union of Soviet Socialist republics. And so then we see the Ukrainian SSR, right? The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic, the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, the Belarus, the Lithuanian, the Latvian, the Estonian, the Moldovan, onward. And so they actually will recognize Ukrainian national identity, Ukrainian language early on. However, in 1918, the Ukrainian nationalists taking this cue, oh, all right, maybe we're going to have a little, a little let up here. They declare their independence. And for a short-lived moment in 1918, the Ukrainians create their independent state. But because of the Russians, of the civil war in Russia with the whites and the reds attempting to, they're fighting it out, who will win? The Bolsheviks or the supporters of the Imperial Russian family? As we know, the Bolsheviks win, and for the next 74 years, it will be the USSR until its collapse in 91. However, what happens here, because the Ukraine was the area where much of the civil war was fought, eventually the Russians realize in the early Soviet era, they really can't have Ukrainian nationalists breaking away, and they crush the Ukrainian independence movement. By the late 30s, late 20s into the late 30s, Stalin is firmly in power. During the Stalin era, there will be a horrible time where the rest of the Ukrainian nationalists and the leadership of the Ukrainian nationalists will perish during the Holodomor. And the Holodomor of 1932-33 is the Russian government's creation of a famine in Ukraine, where they will starve the Ukrainians. And the statistics go anywhere from 4 to 7 million people lost their lives during the Holodomor. Inclusive of that are those who died, of course, from starvation, as well as those who were forced out of Ukraine, the political dissidents, and forced out of Ukraine into the Gulag system, and forced to move into other parts of the Soviet Union. And I might add, right now, in the Donbass region of the Ukraine, the Russian government is forcefully moving Ukrainians out of the Donbass area into distant parts of the Soviet Union. Some are going on their own to get out of the war zone, but many are being forcefully migrated out. And this is the tactic that is reminiscent of this era here itself. So keep this in mind. This is not a history of Ukrainians being able to trust Russians. I'm just throwing that out to you. Of course, the former Soviet bloc itself, I just put this up. Remember, from World War II until 1991, from 45 until 1991, Eastern Europe was under the control of the Soviet Union, of the Russians. And this memory is not lost, which is why in the 90s and into the 2000s, there would be a rush to join NATO. And we'll talk a bit about this in a moment in terms of NATO expansion. So NATO has expanded, and countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the rest, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc., do want Article 5 protection, for the reason when Vladimir Putin said that NATO represents a threat to the Russian Federation, the obverse can also be seen as true that to the countries of Eastern Europe who had been occupied by the Russians, that memory is recent, and it's one that they don't want repeated. Just keep that in mind. So by the time we get to the 1980s, here's my attempt to move quickly. By the time we get to the 1980s, of course, we remember, I didn't put a picture of Reagan. Reagan starts with Glasnost, and he starts with Glasnost, I'm sorry. He starts with Gorbachev, and then, of course, President H.W. Bush continues with Gorbachev. Gorbachev, as you recall, has, Glasnost, Perestroika, and Demokratizatsiya, right? Restructuring, opening up, and democratization of the Soviet Union. However, it doesn't quite go the way Gorbachev had in mind. And by December 1991, the Soviet Union is over. However, prior to that, there was an attempt to keep the Soviet Union in place, reform it, and not to have all the republics break away. In fact, H.W. Bush, President H.W. Bush, even George H.W. Bush, even went to the Ukraine to attempt to convince the Ukrainian parliament not to secede from the Soviet Union. Because the idea was it would create instability. That doesn't happen. The republics succeed. Gorbachev is out. You see at the top, Soviet era fellow, not too happy. Of course, in August 91, right before the Soviet Union collapses, there's a coup, an attempt. I don't know if any of you remember August 91, when the old guard, the old communist guard, make an attempt and they institute a coup. They take over the government. They arrest Gorbachev, who's down vacationing in the Crimea and on the Black Sea somewhere. And it's Yeltsin. In this picture, you see Yeltsin on the tank giving the speech with the tricolor Russian flag. Yeltsin, who essentially comes to the fore. The people pour out into the streets of Moscow, and the old guard are essentially wiped away. Gorbachev realizes once the Russia, Belarus, and Ukrainian sign an agreement to form the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Soviet Union is no more. It collapses, and that's the end of the Soviet Union. And then, of course, in 91, at the very bottom, you see in Maidan Square, you see in Ukraine the celebration as they vote for not only for independence. And in 1991, there is a referendum by region. This is the results in the Ukraine. Do you want to Ukrainian independence, or do you want to remain part of a confederation of republics within the Commonwealth of Independent States, within what is essentially a Russian federation, with a union, a very close union, where your independence would be suspect? And this is the result. And I want you just to look at this result. The western part of the Ukraine, that is very much Ukrainian speakers, not a heavy Russian-speaking population. You can see huge numbers, almost 95, 96%. However, if you go into the center and into the eastern area, the light blue area down into the Crimea, the peninsula at the bottom, that are more Russian-speaking Ukrainians, even there, the overwhelming majority favored independence. So this is 92% essentially approve independence. And the turnout was, I think, 88%, a high turnout. So it is clear what was wanted. Now, in the 1990s, you hear, on the left, you see Clinton, in the middle, Yeltsin, and Kravchuk, the first president of Ukraine. In the 1990s, there is 1991, the Commonwealth of Independent States, that really faded away. But in 1994 and 1997, there is the Budapest Treaty, the Budapest Memorandum. and the 1997, not treat, but Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation. These are treaties that Russia, the first one, Russia, Britain, the United States, and the Ukraine all signed that, number one, see the removal of nuclear weapons from the Ukraine to Russia in exchange for guarantees of Ukrainian independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Again, in 1997, Russia and Ukraine signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation where Russia and Ukraine agree to respect their independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Now, in the 1990s, and there's a really good book called Not One More Inch, which I should have put up there. I can't find it now. But anyway, Not One More Inch, that's about the era of the 1990s. Secretary of State James Baker is purported to have told his counterparts in then the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand 1 more inch eastward, he said. And so keep that in mind, because what Vladimir Putin has been saying for the past 20 years is that the West promised not to expand NATO. And yet they have continually expanded NATO to the border of the Russian Federation. And that Ukraine was the last straw. And that they would not tolerate the expansion of NATO. They would see it as a threat to Russian national security if NATO continued to expand. Remember, there was some talk about expanding into the former Republic of Georgia. There was a war there. That stopped. The Russians came in. The Ukraine in 2008 is in a position where it's about to sign a treaty of cooperation and friendship and a membership plan to become a member of the EU, the European Union, and to begin the process of qualifying for membership in NATO. In 2008, with almost right after that, you see this took several years, and by 2013, 2014, Lukashenko, at this point, the president of Ukraine, will go to Vilnius to sign this EU document. Russia immediately imposes a trade war on Ukraine. The Ukrainian president does not sign the EU agreement, does not begin the process for joining the European Union and the process for making application for NATO. By 2014, there is the Maidan. The Maidan is the central plaza in Kiev, where there was the Orange Revolution early on. But in 2013-14, the people pour out into the streets. Lukashenko is forced to flee because he was essentially doing the bidding of Putin's Russia by not signing the EU agreement. He flees, where he still remains in exile, from what I understand, in Russia. Poroshenko becomes the Ukrainian president, and shortly thereafter, what happens? Russia invades the Crimea, and of course, we are during that time. This map puts together. It's in Russian, but Novorussia, the southern area. So from 2014 until now, referring to this southern region and referring to what is an attempt to create a southeastern region, including the Crimea, to call it New Russia, which you've heard some members of the Russian Duma lately referring to this once more. And this is where we are now, with the war in the reddish, purplish area, the area where the Russian forces have occupied and taken over, and again, harking back historically, because during the Imperial Russian era of the 18th century, this region was referred to as New Russia. And so they are going back, Novorossiya, to what is a precedent historically. And Putin is saying we are doing this out of our own national security. And we are doing this because NATO's expansion is a threat. And that is the argument that the Russians have been using, that NATO expansion has forced us into this hand. And many analysts will be talking about this. One, John Mearsheimer, has said that who is to blame for the Russo-Ukrainian war? The West is to blame. It never should have expanded. The other issue becomes, what does independence and sovereignty mean? If a country is independent and sovereign, does it have a right to make decisions about its own destiny and its own course and not have to worry about its neighbor to the north invading? I think that's a question. And are there peaceful solutions? Will Ukraine's independence and sovereignty and Russia's security concerns be able to have a balance? I'm doubtful, but that's where we're at. And there's something to think about when thinking about the Russo-Ukrainian war that began in 2014 and is still ongoing. So I took longer as usual, and I abbreviated many things as usual, but there is an introduction, and I'm hoping it has left some of you thinking that you don't agree with what you just heard, and so you want to offer an alternative, or that you have a question. Either way, I'm looking forward to a healthy discussion about where do we go from here in terms of the war. Is it simply NATO's expansion that caused this war? And is the West to blame? Or is it something more complex? I tend to think in the complexity area, but I'll stop and leave the floor open now to all of you.
Wow, thank you. Sounds like the first treaty that everybody signed, or that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Was a good idea. Sounds like the second treaty, not one more inch of NATO expansion, was a bad idea, but we signed it. And that gives Putin an excuse.
Oh, I might have went too fast with that. The second treaty of 1997, the Treaty of Friendship between Russia and Ukraine, was guaranteeing Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity. The not one inch, that was supposedly simply a verbal exchange between Baker and his counterpart in the Soviet Union. And
Not a treaty signed, right?
yeah, but no, there was no treaty on that one. That one was just that was the promise that we wouldn't expand NATO. And yet, and I might add just a little more backdrop, that that occurred, that little conversation is what it was. That occurs before any of these countries are independent. And so the Secretary of State of the United States cannot speak for an independent Latvia, Lithuania, et cetera, right? And I think that so just keep that in mind. Those countries have. I mean, that's why I ended. What does independence mean? Do countries have a right? Now, a colleague of mine who right now is in Bucharest, Romania, at a conference on this issue actually, is arguing that NATO expansion is really pushed Putin over the edge. And so there is that school of thought that says that. On the other hand,
I think that, but Putin didn't need that in order to invade Georgia, in order to invade the other one, not Crimea, well, Crimea too, but
He leveled Chechnya. He leveled
Yeah,
the capital of
Chechnya.
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 Grozny.
And he
Yeah,
did it,
Grozny. He made it a parking lot essentially.
and he used his secret service to bomb Moscow hotels and blame it on the Chechens in order to gin up support for that war. I don't think, do you think this situation is closer to World War I or to World War II?
Yeah, I think it's the potential for a greater war is still with us. And that can be some combination of both those wars. Unfortunately, remember, this can escalate, this can continue to escalate. And just as a side note, when Ukraine becomes independent, it has the leftover, it has the Soviet Navy in its ports. It has an army of 800,000 people, 800,000 man army. And so it dwindles down because therefore the new Ukrainian army, as it was, had to swear allegiance to Ukraine. And many of the Russian conscripts, of course, from Russia will go back. And then there are lots of problems in Ukraine, just like in Russia in the 90s and 2000s, with corruption, with the creation of oligarchs. And that's a whole other talk, what happens. However, funding was not available. They did not maintain the armed forces as they should have, perhaps. But they had all these guarantees, and they also had a lease that was signed with Russia to allow, and that lease was signed recently, actually, allowing Russia the port to use the port of Sevastopol for another 25 years, which is in the region of the Crimea, before they occupied the Crimea. And so initially, the Ukrainians did have a lot of the hardware, but they gave up the nuclear weapons because they thought they'd be more secure. Now, some are saying, well, maybe that wasn't a good idea, but using nuclear weapons is never a good idea, is it? So, but in any event, at this point, Ukraine is being devastated. They're putting up quite a fight, but is it NATO's expansion? And Putin has said that all along. However, some argue that Putin, when he came into power in 2000, if you read his speeches, which I've read quite a few of them, if you read his speeches, his early inaugural speeches as president, he is saying point blank that we have to respect our territorial integrity. We have to always think of the security of the fatherland, and we must develop a democracy in Russia. Now, within 8 years, he's no longer saying that, as he and Medvedev play, presidential chair. His prime minister will become president. In the next term, he'll become prime minister. And then eventually, Putin just becomes president for life. So some argue that, of course, who cares what Putin is saying on paper? Because Putin at some point, was a pro-democracy supporter. Later on, has, essentially destroyed the Russian democracy, either murdered or put his opposition into jail, and has essentially destroyed the free press as it was emerging in Russia. And here, 20 years later, he needs another big victory for Russian nationalism, because he has said that he's going in to root out the Nazis and the fascists out of Ukraine, and he's going in to save the Russian speakers who are being genocided against by the Ukrainian government. So obviously, we're in a pickle here. Yes, Andy has his hand up.
Yeah, I was just curious, back in 2014, when the Russians did invade Crimea, that was a bloody battle. Lots of people died. Why was it that Europe didn't react then? I'm surprised. It seems like they must have protested, but it was so easy for Putin to do it. It's almost like they enabled him down the road. He didn't really face any. He wasn't held accountable for that.
So that's a great question. I mean, it was essentially, I think, if I recall, a 3 or 4 week operation within a month. It was the Ukrainians were not prepared. At that point, the Russian army had military experience both in Georgia, Chechnya, Georgia. The Ukrainian army armed forces were underfunded. They had not had any battle experience, and they essentially walked away. It wasn't and gave it, and then the West, the sanctions were lighthearted, frankly. By comparison, the West was not especially united on this issue. Khrushchev, gave the Crimea to Ukraine in 56, I think it was, along with his secret speech. He gave it to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And many argued in the 90s that Crimea should not be allowed to go with the Ukrainian independence, but there was even a majority of vote for independence in Ukraine. And in the 90s, the Russian Federation didn't even have the wherewithal to do anything militarily or otherwise. And of course, in the 90s, I might say the West made a big mistake. I mean, I would say reformulating NATO and looking at ways to bring Russia in might have been much better, frankly. Instead of having this triumphalist, we won the Cold War, because honestly, the US did not win the Cold War. We can go back and forth on that. It was the decay of the Soviet Union and the internal collapse of the Soviet Union that helped lose its own control, frankly, and then with external pressures. But when I went to the Soviet Union in the 80s, I was just struck by the infrastructural decay that I was seeing. And so it might have been funding money into its armed forces, but it was in rough shape internally in terms of its infrastructure. It had been bankrupted by the arms race that Reagan began, frankly, in the 80s. And it was falling apart, in addition to things that had a lot to do with internal political pressures within the Communist Party itself in the 80s. So there was a lot going on internal to the Communist Party and in the Soviet Union that led to its decay. Yet in the 90s, the US really had a triumphalist, we won the Cold War, and as if somehow the Russian Federation was never going to reemerge as a major power. I don't know what world they were occupying, but of course it did. And then as Putin really developed his dictatorship, he did so playing on Russian nationalism. So Andy, to your point, it was a cakewalk. The Crimea, it was a victory. Some have argued, and I'm not going to argue this strenuously, that it was just like when Hitler went into the Ruhr Valley in the Rhineland and remilitarized it. The Allies did nothing. The French, the British did nothing. And had they did something, maybe it would have, the generals in Germany might have not gone along, and Hitler's power base would have been eroded. Now, is that the same with Putin? No, I don't think so. However, the victory, and an easy victory in Crimea, did give him the chops to do what he did in the Donbass. It's been going on. And then, of course, we've been over Western Europe and the United States half-heartedly at first, but in some way have been funding the military, more so within the past 6 years in Ukraine. And the Ukrainian military has been battle-hardened because they've been fighting a war in the Donbass for the past, 8 years, 7 years. And now you see what's happening now. So I don't know if did I answer your question, Andy? I hope. Okay, are there other questions?
David, there's a bunch of questions in the chat too, but Buzz, you've raised your hand, so unmute yourself and go on. There's a bunch of questions in the chat.
Buzz, you're muted.
David, thank you, David. Great talk. Do you see this as a proxy war with particularly between just simply the United States, not necessarily NATO, but the United States and Russia at this point. With we're probably the heavy hitters in terms of of delivering military equipment and technology there. Well, I'd be curious your take on that.
Well, it's absolutely becoming one, but it's not just the U.S. I mean, Germany, the Czech Republic, Poland, Finland, and Sweden now France are sending arms. I'm missing a few. Great Britain is United Kingdom also sending arms, and on top of it, you've had Germany and Poland dramatically increasing their military budgets. Germany, for the first time, for the first time, of course, really looking at a military development and rearmament in a major way, as well as Poland. Poland does not want to be caught flat-footed like it was in World War II, of course. But and now as members of NATO, they're coordinating. They're having military exercises. And let's not underestimate or undervalue what's happened with Sweden and Finland. Sweden and Finland have always maintained neutrality, and Finland has always been neutral because they don't want to anger Russia. And now it's like, forget it, anger them. No, we're going to be ready. I mean, in the Finnish armed forces, they gave the Soviet Union a huge run for their money. And the Finnish armed forces in the Finnish Finland's preparations for war are significant along the roughly 800-mile border with Russia, and as is their construction of underground cities, underground bunkers. You don't realize Finland has constructed many underground bunkers. I mean, cities. Whole complexes where for the major survival of significant portion of their urban populations, and we don't think of the Swedes. I mean, oftentimes we think of the Swedes only, from the Vikings, but the Swedes and Sweden has, they had their heyday in the Viking period militarily, some would say, and in the era of the 17th and 18th centuries. But the Swedish armed forces are well developed. The Swedish Air Force is a very advanced Air Force, and they have been increasing now their budgets, and they want to join NATO. Now, Turkey is holding it up. Erdogan in Turkey is it's like a bazaar. He's trying to get whatever he can get, and we'll see what happens with that, because he can hold that up. But what you have here, though, is a frightening situation, because, as someone here said, security concerns aside, is the desirability of Ukraine to Putin related to Ukraine's natural resources? Okay, yeah, the breadbasket issue. So already we can see that from a nationalist perspective, in terms of great chauvinistic Russian nationalism, Ukraine is important. From food production, the wheat production in Ukraine. Ukraine has very fertile soil. Right now, the Russians are taking shiploads of wheat out of Mariupol. I think it is. I forget, one of the ports down there. And they're attempting to take grain right out of Ukraine. But it's also metallurgy. Ukraine is known for its metals. Ukraine was a major exporter of steel. And that whole Donbass region is an industrial zone. And so it's an industrial zone. And that industrial zone, of course, is what Putin is taking. And so both for its ports and its grain and its industry. So yeah, resources is a major factor here. There's no question about that, I think. Yeah.
Also,
But just to finish the thought, in terms of a proxy war, right now the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has just said that the sale of new rocket systems, the shipment of new rocket systems from the West, from the US and the West into Ukraine, Lavrov said it's a provocation. And you have to wonder, that's a provocation. And you say, well, isn't your invasion a provocation? But what he means is it's a provocation because it's another attempt or another hint that perhaps Russia will begin to interrupt the supply lines coming out of NATO Europe of arms into Ukraine. If that happens, you could see a wider war. Now, what's, I think, preventing a wider war is the nuclear reality. You don't want to see nuclear powers going to war against one another. And then Russian security concerns will be seen very clearly. And they would then probably be prepared to use tactical nuclear weapons. Who knows where that could lead? And I might add, just as a side note, that there's a huge campaign in Russia right now in the educational institutions that's perpetrating the great Russian nationalist mythology about Russian security interests, and that the Russians are going into Ukraine to root out the fascists and the Nazis and prevent the genocide against Russian speakers. A former colleague of mine who I had an exchange program with, and we actually co-taught a class back in the early 90s, at Moscow Pedagogical University, is listed as giving a speech, and I listened to it's in Russian only, in his speech, and to a bunch of students where he was essentially, and this is happening across the board, promulgating the myth of Russian nationalism and of the fact that there really is no Ukrainian national identity, it's Russian. So it's really happening right across the board. So I don't know if that answered your question, Buzz, but I tried to address it. Pamela?
About a proxy war. If we want the war to end through negotiations, right, in order to spare Ukraine from being destroyed, but then if the West, if the United States doesn't want to stop the war, if the United States wants to continue in hopes of destabilizing Putin, which is what they are doing, if Zelensky and the Ukrainian government has no power to promise removal of sanctions, then Putin has no reason to negotiate. And that's the situation right now, right?
I don't think Putin has any reason to negotiate. Right now, he's in it for the long haul. And Kissinger, who's 98 years old now, and whose policies divided Cyprus, frankly. In 1974, when the Turks occupied Cyprus, it's Kissinger's advice and policies that led the United States to allow the Turks to remain. And so here we are all these years later, Cyprus remains divided. 40% of the island is in the Turkish minority, and with the Turkish government of Cyprus only, of course, recognized by Turkey. So Kissinger now, that's the same Kissinger from Cyprus. Now, this is also the Kissinger from all kinds of things, right? He had some successes too. But Kissinger has just said, and I was amazed that he's still out there saying things at 98. God love him, because I know a lot of people don't. But Kissinger has said that, look, Zelensky and Ukraine they just have to realize that the Crimea and the Donbass and that southern corridor down to Mariupol, that's just lost. Just give it up. And Zelensky is saying, no, those are Russian, Ukrainian territories. We're not just going to give them up. And of course, Putin is counting on a fracturing taking place in the long run in the West. There's already holes, right? So as the West is putting an embargo on oil, on sanctions on and cutting off their gas purchasing and oil purchasing, and then Putin is shutting off gas supplies. But Putin is selling his oil through India and through China, and so he's still getting the petrodollars. It's all the petrodollars that are helping fuel this war. So all the sanctions in the West are being somewhat off put by what's happening with India and China, and also the Saudis. The Saudis are they could be increasing flow of oil, right, to help deal with the inflation issues and what have you, and instead they're not. So Putin has many other avenues to make his petrodollars, and many other avenues, I think, to circumvent what the West is doing, and he's hoping it's going to fracture in time. So you're right, Pamela. Why negotiate unless there's some major? And I think maybe the Russians fear this. Maybe there's some, unless there's some major turn of events where the Ukrainian military, as they're getting more and more hardware, actually begin to put another dent into the Russian military. And we've already read about mutinies. I don't know if they're real, but at this point, I wouldn't hold on. I wouldn't sell the ticket at the bazaar for Putin's demise right yet in Russia. I mean, what could happen in time as the body bag count goes up in Russia? That's another story.
I
But
think it's a really bad thing for the US to do that, not to give Zelensky the power to give up, to tempt Putin with the removal of sanctions, because he isn't going to do anything without that.
right. So, but the U.S. is walking a tightrope. I don't know if it was President Biden or Secretary of State. Some U.S. government official today said the rockets that we're sending to Ukraine will not be able to reach Russia, and that the Ukrainians have promised not to use them against Russian territory. So how all this plays out, here's the other problem. Once war begins, the beast of war has a mentality all of its own that the best laid plans cannot do anything about. And once the war, and this is why this war is so dangerous right now, and this is why some negotiated settlement, you're right, should be what's happening. But at this point,
But it can't be unless we allow the sanctions lifting, and unless Zelensky has the power.
so
And the US
yeah.
won't give Zelensky that power.
Well, Zelensky's not imposing the sanctions. It's Western Europe and the
That's
US.
my
imposing.
point. We have to give Zelensky the power to negotiate with Russia. Right now, Zelensky has none.
Yeah,
We have the power of the sanctions. He doesn't.
well, on the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians were negotiating in Belarus with their Russian counterparts early on, and they were getting nowhere, because at this point, I really do think that it looks like, just from what I'm hearing about, Russian parliament members talking about annexing, let alone recognizing that southeastern corridor, they really are talking about annexing whole sections of the Ukrainian territory, regardless of what the West or Zelensky does. So I don't know. I can't prognosticate. I don't know where we're going with this. All I know is where we are and how we got here. I don't know where we'll go. I really don't. But right now, someone asked about how effective are the sanctions. They seemed really effective, yet there are all these ways of getting around them. So I don't know how effective they're going to be. In terms of the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church has come out in full swing support of this. But that's getting back to the point, Russian society right now, you see a few cracks, a few journalists, a few oligarchs who then go into hiding or are arrested, are indicating that they don't want this war to continue. Again, we don't know what that means in Russian society. So that's a wild card for us at this point. Any other? Let me see what we have here in the chat.
Well, it seems to me when we're talking about the Crimea, the shipping lanes, the industrial areas, if Russia annexes those and keeps them, they've weakened the Ukraine a great deal.
Yeah, it does.
The next time somebody wants to make a move on the Ukraine, it's going to be monumentally easier. So there's some really good valid reasons for Zelensky not to just want to let those go.
The problem with the Donbass, it's the industrial area. And you're absolutely right, I think, Luann. And that makes this a mess, even more so. There's no, by the way, I don't think there's any good solution here. That book by Paul Dineri essentially ends with, there is no good solution. Putin's Russia, they want that southeast corridor. Zelensky, yes, he's Jewish. So, I mean, the whole argument about the Nazis and the fascists, that's all going back to World War II at a time when, for a brief moment, the Ukrainian fascist groups signed on with Hitler and the Nazis because they wanted to get the Soviet Union off them for a little bit. But that was just one group. And there are elements today still in Ukrainian society that along those fascist lines. But there are also those elements in Russia.
In the
So that's
US,
not,
and in the US here.
the US as well, and throughout Europe.
Yeah,
So that's
but-
no justification.
But also in Ukraine, they really tried to get parliament seats. All those neo-Nazi organizations, the Azov Battalion and
Yep.
all, they joined up and they ran as a group and they lost. They
Yes, they
didn't
did.
get any. The democracy in Ukraine actually works. If there were no Nazis,
Well,
if they were
absolutely.
totally suppressed, then it wouldn't be a democracy anymore.
So, and the reason I put that map up with the percentages that showed you for the independence is that was across the board. And even up until recently, this is being imposed from the Russian separatist organizations and with the support of Putin's government.
I think it's propaganda from Putin, and who has studied Hitler and Goebbels the same way Trump has, that these authoritarians, totalitarians do. There's some really good Planet Money podcasts about the way the propaganda worked.
Yeah.
I put a link to the one from 2017 in there, rough translation in Ukraine. Russia prepared for the war before it publicized it.
The problem as I see it is that since the late 2000s, Putin's Russia has been attempting to influence Ukraine by supporting one of its major presidential candidates and someone who became president, Lukashenko. And that helped create the Maidan protest in 2014 that saw Lukashenko flee, and he created, in his eyes, an exile, Ukrainian government in exile in Russia. But then we're not that far away. Then 2014, the Russians just come in and start taking land once they're no longer able to influence the Ukrainian government in the way they thought. Because when Poroshenko comes in, and then after him, of course, Zelensky, they're not willing to be the puppets of Putin. And I think, some of my colleagues will disagree with me, but I think that has been the biggest issue here. Putin has lost his ability to influence short of direct control. And so he's opted out for direct control. And yeah. So, but to your point, I'm less willing to say that Putin has studied, Hitler and Goebbels. I'm not saying he hasn't, but Putin is really doing something else. He's really hearkening back to great white Russian, if you would, chauvinism. He's hearkening back to traditional imperial Russian policies when it comes to Ukraine. This is not new. This is out of the playbook of Imperial Russia, frankly, where these are the little Russians. There's another one. Yeah, Mussolini to the present strongman. So, I mean, There is a dictatorial tradition, an authoritarian tradition that's purely Russian. Remember, Russia has an authoritarian lineage that goes back to its beginnings, frankly, and he's in that playbook. This is the Soviet misinformation, you could say. I mean, when I saw this former colleague of mine essentially saying that there's no such thing as Ukrainian, it's simply Russian, and these textbooks that talk about Ukrainian independence are just lies and Western influence. This is a very traditional Russian sort of Slavophile versus Western tension. That and again, this tension between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers goes all the way back to Peter the Great. And when Peter the Great started building St. Petersburg, and with its window to the west, and forcing the boyars to shave off their beards, their long beards, and stop wearing the traditional Russian dress and garments, and wear Western style dress, and start to speak French. And he brought in French culture. He brought in all the architects from Italy. It's no accident that St. Petersburg is built with all those canals. It was to be the Venice of the North. And if you haven't been to St. Petersburg, it's beautiful, right? The old St. Petersburg. I've been there 3 times, and it's just, I mean, what he was doing in creating this Western city, the architectural wonders, of course, on the backs of, and on the deaths of thousands of serfs. So I mean, he built it on at great human cost, but the Tsars didn't care about that, and which of course led to the revolution later on. But anyway, it's another story. But when he was building that, he was saying, we're going to Westernize. That tension between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles, which you saw play out in 19th century Russian literature. If you look at Russian literature throughout the 19th century, you can see these tensions. Well, that's what's playing out now too. What has Putin done? What is he using as the emblem and the symbol of the Russian Federation? It's the double-headed eagle. The double-headed eagle is the symbol of the Byzantine Empire, right? That is the eagle that comes from Rome and then brought to the Third Rome, and it becomes the symbol of the Romanovs dynasty. So we have the double-headed eagle, the tricolor flag of Imperial Russia. And if you see all the trappings of all the ceremony, whenever Putin as president goes to make a speech, it's the Imperial March. I have another video, and we don't have time for it, it's 20 of 9, where, in one of his last early inaugurations, Putin is essentially marching as one of the Tsars. So he is feeding into not the Westernizing aspect, because in the 2000s, you could have argued that Putin was going with the Westernizers. He was courting the West. Putin, who is multilingual. He's a smart man. He was courting the West, culturally and otherwise. And then something shifts, and in the late 2000s, he goes toward the Slavophiles. He goes much toward the authoritarian streak, obviously, in the traditional Russian authoritarianism. So you could say, and I don't, that he is carrying on in the footsteps of the Slavophiles that see authoritarianism, autocracy, nationalism, and orthodoxy as the 3 hallmarks of what a great Russia should be. Now, it's no accident that autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationalism were, of course, the values or the hallmarks of Imperial Russia. He's following in that footsteps, and retaking Ukraine is part of that, you could argue. Now, I could be all wrong, every way to any way, but I'm just saying that's what it looks like to me. And there's been this major shift. And the West actually hasn't helped with its expansion of NATO, to be quite frank. There was no reformulation of the NATO alliance to include Russia in the 90s. There was no reformulation of Western ties with Russia economically. They were very hesitant. They saw Russia as corrupt. They saw, and it was. And then, I mean, I traveled there a great deal in the 90s. And sure it was. But so wasn't the Wild West. So isn't any new society and anything new. But I think it was a lost opportunity. I think the triumphalism of the 90s was, we lost an opportunity. And then we got into the reaction in the 2000s. And now here we are with an authoritarian Russia, with autocracy and orthodoxy, meaning Russian orthodoxy, and nationalism at the fore at the expense of Ukraine. And I don't know where we're heading, but it's not good. And I don't know what the solutions are. And the more we arm Ukraine, I think we have no choice in the West. I say we, I'm not arming them. But I think the West has no choice at this point. At the same time, where will that go? You know, how do you get back to the negotiating table? As Pamela said, do you stop the sanctions and will that get Putin back to the negotiating table? I don't know. I really don't know. I think that all I've tried to do tonight is offer a window and a perspective with some history, and I don't have any answers of where we're going to end up. If I did, then I would be one of the oligarchs maybe, and then perhaps I could invite Putin and all of them over to my house for dinner, and then with Zelensky, and we could figure this out. But unfortunately, it's not happening. And it's I'll end with this, really, that I'm afraid for the future right now. I don't have any hope, and my only hope is that something good comes. I don't see it coming out of the current relations, and I really don't. And I really don't. So Andy says, when the war ends, will Ukraine demand reparations? Let's let the war end, and let's see. And I don't mean to end it on such a dour note, but if you can share with me some hope, then please do, because what I have seen so far, as of just today, with the Russian foreign minister saying this is a provocation, sending rockets, and then what happens when those rockets start destroying munitions depots in Russian territory, for instance, or what happens? There's a lot of what ifs. So I don't know where we're going to be at. I hope I provided some historical context, something to think about. And if I have, then I've been successful. If I haven't, oh well, I did my best. Thank you very much for putting up with me. If there's any other questions, fine. I'm willing to engage them. Otherwise, I think I'm getting tired too. But anyway, anything else?
Well, I just, kind of wonder, it seems like Putin really wants to make his mark on the world. And it doesn't seem like he personally wants to stop. He's putting everything he can muster into it. And it also seems like a lot of the Russian people, like you read these stories about the armies coming in and doing horrible things and sending things from the Ukrainians home. It's like, perhaps there are problems enough in Russia, so they need the war to hold them together too. So they may not want to let go of it. And that's kind of scary.
That's a major component here. I mean, this war, I think, was seen as being a very very positive from the Russian perspective. It was going to rebuild again. Putin is rebuilding the Russian Federation. He's rebuilding Russia as a great power. We were hobbled 20 years ago, Russia. Now we're not hobbled. We're a great power. And he really was putting the feather in his cap. However, he expected this to be another Crimea. He did not expect this, from all accounts, to be what it is. And there are little fractures. There's fissures in the support, and you can see them now and again. But he has such tight control over his government, over the society, right now, those fishes will have to get larger. And then you don't know what will happen. So there's an undercurrent in Russia. Remember, there is a tradition of samizdat in Russia, a tradition of, self-publication, a tradition, samizdat is the Russian imperial word and the Soviet word. And it just means, self-publishing, handwriting things, word of mouth, get the word out amongst ourselves quietly so that we don't have to deal with the censors, we don't have to deal with officialdom. That can be working, but that, to create some opposition, but that takes a lot of time and it's not without its problems. And by the way, had this been quick, Putin would be riding high in Russia. But right now he still is. Russian national feeling is still riding high. What will happen again, not to repeat, but I am, when the war, if it continues to go badly. But Russia has more resources than Ukraine and more people. He can play a war of attrition longer, much to the detriment of Ukrainian society and people and to ongoing tensions. So if he's in it for the long game, and if he's surrounding himself with yes men, as it seems to be, that's where it's frightening. So, but anyway, let's have some hope. Walter Benjamin once said, he was a philosopher of the 20s, once said, I hope I'm getting this correct, quoting someone after almost 2 hours of talking is never a good thing, but I'll go out on a limb. I think it was Walter Benjamin who said, "It is for those without hope that hope exists." So I'll leave you with that. It is, if there seems to be no hope, then it is for those without hope that we have hope. So let us go forward. And to that, may you all be well, and may you continue to be well, and may we meet one more time on some other topic, or even on this one, or some aspect of this. I'm always ready, unfortunately, to talk about something. But I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope I've covered. I'm looking in the chat. I'm hoping that I've addressed all your questions. Kharkiv, same thing. Yes. If Paul Jameson is still here, yes, Paul, same thing. I
am still here.
Yeah, same thing. Just one is the Ukrainian, the other the Russian. Actually, another part of this, the story about Volodymyr and Yaroslav and the Kievan Rus, that's a fascinating story in and of itself, if we had a lot of time, but we don't. Okay, for someone who said he's tired and I'm still talking, I'll stop now.
Thank you
And
very
thank you
much.
very much
Thank you.
for your patience. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, David.